Hey everybody, happy Wednesday. Hope everybody's doing well. We're approaching the holiday season right now. I think there's like 11 major holidays in the next 30 days or something crazy. And we're a global store. We ship all over the planet to like 90 some countries. So if there's a holiday that your culture celebrates and gift giving is part of that holiday, then hit a brother up. We can help you be the best gift giver there is. Just as an FYI, we got these little guys in this week. This is the HX1. You guys all know how big a Helix person I am. This thing it's a stomp box. It's a single stomp box that has inside it pretty much every effect that the Helix has. So if you've already got your pedal board built and you're like, man, I really would like to use the IR reader from the Helix, or I would really like one of the crazy reverbs that's in there, or one of the flangers or whatever from the Helix, this could be that thing. And they're I think $300 or something like that. So it's a pretty cool little product. If you've already got your pedal board built, you just need one more effect. You're like, of course, we only need one more, right? You only need one more. But it could be a flanger today, and it could be a reverb tomorrow. It could be a delay the next day. It could be an IR reader, whatever. So yeah, just FYI, that's a thing that's happening. I am excited because this week is week 3 of our Effects on Violin series. This is going to be our second week talking about EQ. And you're like, wait, we did EQ last week. We did do EQ last week, but I'll get to why we're doing it again. If you were here last week, stay, don't leave. It's going to be different stuff. So in this series, this Effects on Violin series, we're going to hit a different effect each week. And for each of those effects, we will talk about what that effect is, what does it do, some of the common parameters that you can control with that effect, and then how you might want to use that effect on strings, on violin, viola, cello. And a lot of these weeks, we're going to have guest artists that join us to talk about how they use that particular effect on their instrument. And I've got 11 or 12 of these weeks lined up, I think. And we've got guest artists for most of them. And some of these are artists we've talked to before. Some of these are going to be people that you have not seen on our platform before. And I'm excited because a lot of these people that you haven't seen us talk to, they got a lot of cool stuff to say. So I'm looking forward to it. 2 weeks ago, week 1, we did gain structure. And while gain structure is not technically an effect, if you don't get gain structure right, none of your effects are going to matter because gain structure is the thing that makes them all work right. So that was week 1. If you didn't see that, please go back and watch that. Gain structure, we say in engineering that gain structure is probably 90% of the battle. If you've got your gains all structured right, you're like almost there in having a good mix. Week 2, we talked about EQ, and we had guest artist Timothy Huh with us. We talked about the definition of EQ, how to use high-pass filters, shelf filters, bell filters. We described what various frequencies sounded like, and we got a lot of stuff. We covered a lot of ground last week. But then I got some questions in the comments that I went, well, maybe I need to do a better job of explaining this stuff, or we need to dig into some areas that we had not dug into. When I was putting this presentation together for last week, the EQ presentation, my wife was kind of watching over my shoulder. She was like, I actually want to learn a lot of this. And she's in medicine. She's not in music. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole here. And I ended up cutting a lot of that stuff from the presentation because I didn't want it to go 3 hours. So some of that stuff that I had put in there is back because we got this comment here and it tells me that maybe I should have left some of that stuff in. So one of the questions was, if EQ affects tones but not notes, or does it? If I cut the lows and mids, why don't my notes start sounding sharp? And if I boost the highs, will my E string become louder than my C string? And I don't think they are the only person that had this question. So first things first, I want to say that in music, the word sharp has a very specific definition, and it's not what a lot of people in the world would use for that definition. I'm married to someone who's not a musician. And so sometimes I have to remember that the vocabulary that we use is not the vocabulary that the world uses. When we say sharp, that is talking about intonation for musicians. Like a C sharp is a different note than a C. Or if I'm playing a D and my teacher goes, hey, you're a little sharp on that. They don't mean that like my tone is bitey. What they mean is I'm out of tune. My third finger's gone too high on the A string and needs to come back. Okay. You're sharp. You're out of tune. You need to fix that. When non-musicians use the word sharp, they will like, that's a really sharp sound. They're not talking about intonation. They're talking about tonality. And they're talking about the fact that it's cutting them. It's hurting. It's high frequencies. It's bitey. It's strident. It's stabby. Some of these other words. But sharp for us has a very specific meaning. And I think the question here is, do those notes start sounding sharp? Meaning, are they sounding out of tune? No. So EQ, we'll get into this. We'll talk about RTAs. We'll talk about overtones and undertones. We will talk, and that's going to push us into loudness. So we'll talk about actual versus perceived loudness. And we're going to give a bunch of examples. I've got a violin loop that I recorded, and I've got a cello loop that I recorded. And we're going to do some EQ on those loops and in real time so you can see and hear what we're talking about when we're talking about cutting this or boosting that or trimming or sculpting or whatever it is that we're doing. Okay, so strap in. It could be a few minutes. This is going to be the short version of this video, which is posted on YouTube and should be live in about 20 minutes. It went almost half an hour. So, and that's without taking questions. That's none of that. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. What is an RTA? An RTA is a real-time analyzer, and it is a thing that allows us to visualize things that we're hearing. It takes the things that you're hearing and it puts them in a visual format. I'm a visual learner. This RTAs are super helpful for me. And it's going to allow us to use our eyes to train our ears as to what we're hearing. RTAs are found in front of house boards. If you have a digital console, it almost certainly has an RTA in it. Any of your DAWs will have them. So if you're using Logic or GarageBand or any of those different DAWs to record yourself, or you can get it as a smartphone app. And I think I showed you guys last week just a short, like I showed you my phone. I had to unlock it, which was a little weird, unlocking my phone in front of all you guys. I felt kind of funny. Anyway, so you can get a smartphone app. There are some paid ones. There are some free ones. But in any case, it's going to help you visualize the things that you're hearing. And I think it's going to be very, very beneficial. So here are two different RTAs. The top one is off of my phone, and it's using a bar graph style. The bottom one is from Logic. It's a DAW, and it's using a line style. And both of these, I fed it a sine wave at 440 hertz. Now, the top one, you can see two bars. You're going, well, it's a sine wave. Why am I seeing two bars? Because neither one of those bars are designed to show 440 hertz. They're designed to show, one of them is like 400 and the other one's 450 or whatever, 450 and 500. So it kind of, that sine wave lands between those two bars. So both of those bars are going to pop up. On the bottom one, you can see there's basically just a spike at 400 hertz. And so that's what's happening there. Now, if A is 440 hertz, when I play an open A on my violin, shouldn't my RTA look like this? But it doesn't. It looks like this. This is what an open A on a violin looks like on the bottom. And that's the sine wave on the top. Well, wait a minute. What's going on here? I thought I was playing 440 hertz. Well, you are. You can see the fundamental tone right there at 440 hertz are those two little spikes that are popping up on the top. And then you'll also see those two little spikes on the bottom. But then there's a whole bunch of other frequencies too, right? So those are what we call overtones. And overtones are what make your instrument sound like your instrument. Because it turns out that a piano and a trumpet and a viola and a violin, they all sound different. And that sounding different means that there are different overtones and different frequencies coming at you than you would get. Your ear can hear all these things that you're seeing, if that makes sense. So if we want to imagine that each one of these little red bars that we're seeing imagine that we've got a big console, like a big soundboard with a bunch of faders on it, and each one of those red bars is a separate channel, or it's got a separate fader associated with it. What EQ does, it allows us to turn all those up or down. So we can take each frequency and we can make it louder or quieter, but we can't move it to the left or to the right. That's pitch shifting, and that's a whole different thing. So when we say, would EQ make my sound sharper or flatter with the musical understanding of those words? Is it going to change the pitch of my note? No, it does not. Those fundamental frequencies are still going to be right there. They're not going to move to the left or the right, but they might move up or down. They might get louder or quieter, but they're not going to change frequencies. There are other effects that change frequencies, and those, like I said, those are called pitch shifters. So EQ, we often refer to it, and I've already said it today, refer to it as sculpting our tone. And it's a pretty good analogy if we think about from like a sculptor standpoint, and not clay, but maybe marble. We've got a big block of marble, and we're going to chip away the marble that we don't want, and we're going to carve David is what we're going to do. We're going to Michelangelo. Anybody can do it. All you do is just chop away all the stuff that doesn't look like David, and look how easy that was. So you can't boost something that's not there. That's one of the fundamental rules, and we can't fundamentally change it. I can't change that block of marble into a block of wood, no matter how good a sculptor I am. I can make it any shape I want to, depending on how good I am at this thing. But I cannot change it from marble to wood, and I can't make it bigger. I mean, I could use Flex Seal or something to put another piece of marble on there. But in general, think about EQ as like you're chopping down a big block of marble to turn it into something else. So like my voice is kind of high, kind of thin, kind of scratchy when I'm singing. We can't make me sound like Barry White. There's no amount of boosting the lows that's going to make me sound like Barry White. There aren't any lows there to boost. Okay, so you're going to turn up the lows. All you're going to get is a bunch of, and you're going to get feedback is what you're going to get. And I'm not going to sound like Barry White. I'm just going to sound really feedbacky. So you can't boost things that aren't there. And then you can't actually give me the talent that Barry White has either. It would be really nice if you could, but then I wouldn't be making videos here. So let's do an example. I recorded a loop of a very common electric violin, the YEV. I'm going to loop some of that playing, and we're going to start messing with the EQ on that so that you guys can hear what happens when we start messing with some of these EQs. So we are here. I opened up a Logic instance right here. Got to click over to my computer and let it know that, yes, in fact, I am in Logic. I'm doing this on purpose. All right, so I'm going to start playing this thing. The very first thing you're going to notice is at the bottom end, if you were here last week, you remember that Timothy Ha told us that on the left side of the screen there, on those lower frequencies, those use much, much, much more energy than the ones on the right. And it's actually, it's a reverse, it's a 1/x curve is what it, for all the math people here. So, 1/20 hertz, and then think over 1/20,000. So at 20 hertz, you're using way more energy than you're using up at 20K or 10K or 5K. And all that energy is going to the board out front, and the board does not know which frequency that energy is. It just knows that it's energy. And roughly half of the energy in this entire spectrum is below 40 hertz. And your violin, it's not making anything useful really below about 200 hertz or 150 on a 5-string. So all the stuff that you see below 150 is garbage. It's crazy amounts of energy that you're sending to the front of house that is inaudible, and even if you could hear it, it wouldn't sound good. So we're gonna look at how much of that there is, and we're gonna dump it out using a high pass filter. So here we go. Here we go. Okay, so you can see how much of that energy we just took out of there by doing that. Watch this. Okay, that's going to clean up your signal a lot that's going out front. Now, the next thing we're going to do, I said last week that the way I like to set a high pass is I will start running up that frequency until it starts to make my violin sound bad. Like I'm going to hear it cutting in to the frequencies that I want to keep, and then I'll back it off a little bit. So let's do that here. So I've got that up to about 200 hertz, and it's still, there's still all the bottom end in there that you really want. And we've cut out a ton of garbage energy. Now, the other thing to think about is context. If I'm a solo violinist, I'm the only one on stage, I might just leave all that in there, fine, just whatever, I'll let my front of house guy deal with it. If I'm going to be playing in an ensemble, maybe there's guitars up there and pianos and singers and all that, we want to get rid of as much of that bottom end as we can. And we're actually probably going to make this even thinner than we normally would so that it sits nicely in a mix. And that's when people ask me, hey, do you have some settings that you would give me for EQ? The answer is no, I don't. Because I don't know what context you're in. We have to adjust all these things for the speakers that you're using. We have to adjust these things for the room that you're in. Maybe the room you're in is really boomy and we need to pull some of this low-end stuff out. So you're not going to set your EQ and then never touch it again for the rest of your life. It's going to be dependent on every situation that you're in. So if you're playing in a string ensemble and there are violas, you're playing first violin because of course you are. Maybe there's second violins, violas, and cellos. We're probably going to bite further into our sound. We're going to push that high pass up higher than we would have to leave room for the people below us so we're not cluttering up those low frequencies, okay? So the next thing that we want to do is we want to start pulling down some of these high frequencies. It's another thing Timothy talked about last week, is we're going to start pulling down. Let's put on a shelf on here. Whoops, that's not the right one. This one. There we go. Pull this down, and then we'll make that a shelf. That's still not the one I want. I want this one. There we go. Ah, there it is. You got to hit the right button, Matt. So we're going to put a shelf on these frequencies. And the other thing I like to do is A-B these things. So I'm going to put this shelf where I think I want it, move it around a little bit, and then when I think I've found the spot, I'm going to turn it on and off so that I can hear the difference. And some of these things might be a preference issue. You might like the way it sounds better without it. Maybe you like the way it sounds better with it. This is an art and a science. So that's how we're going to do this here. So you can see with that shelf, you can hear what that shelf does. It takes a lot of the sort of that hiss in that we talked about. Timothy used the word air last week, all that stuff up above about 10K, we would call that air. So if I'm sort of cutting about here, we're getting some of that air, but it's also, we like air. Air's good, right? But the double-edged sword on that is hiss. So we don't want hiss. We do want a little bit of space, which is why we're not rolling it all the way off. It's just a shelf. Okay, the other thing is if you're saying, well, I got a 5-string violin and I want it to sound like a violin, then maybe we'll leave this shelf out of here. If I want it to sound like a viola, maybe we put it down here, right? So again, all of this is context dependent. So it depends on if you'd rather have a viola-y sound or a violin-y sound, or if you'd like to get rid of some of that hiss, sometimes that bow scratch. Some people, the way they play, they get a lot of bow scratch in their sound. Bow scratch is going to be all up in those higher frequencies too. Now, the next one we want to look at is right in this area here. And if you're using a piezo pickup, you're aware of what they call the dreaded piezo quack. And that's going to be in this area here. And you can get pretty aggressive with cutting that. So let's hear. Okay, so I think you can kind of hear that we've gotten rid of a little bit of that sort of quacky sound. Yeah, I'm not going to make any doctor jokes. So that's where that sound comes from. We can get rid of some sound in that sort of 3 to 4K range, and it's gonna tame that piezo pickup quite a bit. Now, I did promise the cellists that we would get to them. So I don't play the cello. I do play the 7-string violin though. So let's listen to some cello. Even with cello, we still want to use a high-pass filter because remember, a ton of the energy that we're using is, I think I just messed something up. No, I didn't. Okay. A ton of the energy that we're using is coming from those low frequencies, right? And a cello, even though it's producing stuff in the 40, 50, 60 hertz range, it's not really producing anything between 20 and 50 that we want to keep. And that could be almost half of the energy that we're sending to front of house. So let's listen here and then we'll cut. So I've still got a ton of that bottom end sound. You can still feel all that pressure in your chest. But we did cut a ton of energy out by putting our high pass around 50 or so hertz. So that's going to make a big difference, not necessarily in what you can hear, but in what the electronics can hear. And the electronics are going to affect what you hear because it's going to be kicking the compressor in on that low, or the engineer is going to have to gain you down because you're sending them a ton of energy that's just garbage. So the next thing about a cello is that we sometimes want that nice round full sound. If you're an unaccompanied cello, that's great. If you're in a mix, you might be taking up space that other people need. So we might dish out a little bit here. I might take kind of a wide pull right here, and it's going to clean that sound up a lot. It's still going to sound rich. It's still going to sound cello-y, still going to sound woody, but a little less cluttered. All right, so hopefully those are kind of some examples that are going to help you a little bit. I'm going to come back to my other screen here. And then it's going to yell at me because I'm getting away from this thing. It's going to be, gosh, you shut off the thing. And yeah, I sure did. Okay, so those are some examples. And now I couldn't see any of your comments when I was doing that. Yes. Hey, Timothy, I'm glad you're back. Let's come here and go to here and put that comment in there. Yes, there is a bunch of there's a bunch of stuff that happens when you're using IRs, which is what we're talking about next week, by the way. If you can avoid heavy cuts. Yeah. The other thing that I will say too, and I think we talked about this last week, if you're doing a bunch of EQ, if you've got a bunch of really crazy stuff happening other than your high pass filter, you probably have a source issue. And that's true for drums. It's true for vocals. It's true for violins. It's true for all these things. If you're looking at your EQ and it's like really crazy wonky, you probably have other problems. And that's a good indication. Either that or you're trying too hard. You're like trying to go after, like, I like to use EQ as like a chainsaw, not as a scalpel. We're if we're using the sculpting analogy, I would say that we want to do sculpting. I'm not going to be out here trying to make David out of EQ. I may take about 20 or 30 good whacks at that thing, and it's we've pared it down quite a bit. But that's where that sculpting analogy falls through a little bit. If we're just really working super tiny details, like I need to get this, I need to get that one tiny, just pull it down 1 dB and it's super, super tight. And that's too much, man. You've probably got a source issue. So either that or you're trying too hard, and believe me, your ear can't hear the difference, and your audience's ear certainly can't tell the difference. All right. So back to loudness. When we're talking about EQ, one of the things we're talking about is loudness, because you could hear that when we started cutting some of these frequencies out of there, it's actually getting quieter, right? Because I'm pulling energy out of this thing. And if I'm pulling it out in the audible frequencies, it is in fact making it quieter. So it makes us think about, well, what is this loudness thing? You said we're pulling all this garbage frequencies out of the bottom, and it's making my signal, I'm not sending as much energy through the line, but it's not affecting what I hear. So if there's an actual loudness and a perceived loudness, what is that all about? So actual loudness is how much energy I'm sending through the wire. And that energy, some of it may be audible, some of it may not. If we're talking about violin and I'm sending a bunch of 20 to 50 hertz energy through there, that is actual loudness that a machine is going to hear. You and I aren't hearing it. We're not perceiving that. So, and of course, every one of us has been to a concert where you're like, dang, it is really, really loud in here. It hurts me. I'm not enjoying this. And you could pull out a meter and go, man, it's only 85 dB. It's really not technically very loud, but my ears are fatigued. It feels just stabby. It feels, it doesn't feel good. I've been to concerts. There was one particular time I have a buddy that was on staff at a mega church in Atlanta, and I'd gone down to hang out with them during one of their sound checks. And it sounded like a warm blanket. That room sounded so good. The band was amazing. The mix was incredible. And I turned to say something to my buddy Jared, and he just kind of laughed. And I went to say something, and it occurred to me there was no way he was going to hear what I was saying. He just pointed to the front of house console. It was like 105 dB in that room. It didn't feel like 105 at all. It felt like about 80. And they were able to get a high actual loudness mix without the perceived loudness. It just felt so good. So what we want is we want a good actual loudness and a good perceived loudness. And then we want those things to kind of line up. So if we're doing a thing where I've got a distortion sound and a clean sound, I want them to be about the same level, right? When I kick my distortion on, I don't want it to be like, oh, wow, that's way louder than it was. The thing about distortion is we're adding a lot of high frequency artifacts. They don't carry a lot of energy, so they're not going to affect the actual mathematical loudness very much, but they do affect the perceived loudness, so it's going to sound louder than it actually is. So we've got to try to balance those out. I want my distortion sound to sound like it's as loud as my clean sound, not a whole lot louder, maybe a little, because distortion's awesome. But I want my distortion sound to have roughly the same perceived loudness as my clean sound, even if they don't meter out the same way. So let's talk about Fletcher Munson. It's named after, these curves are named after two guys. I bet you'll never guess what their names are. But the way this chart works, and you'll see 100 phone, 80 phone, 60 phone. What the heck is a phone? A phone is, if I put this thing at 60 decibels at 1,000 hertz, that's 60 phones. So it sounds like it's 60 decibels at 1,000 hertz. And then what they do is they give you a little fader. And they say, we're going to sweep this frequency up and down. And I want you to move that fader so that the volume that you're hearing sounds the same. Right? So as they start sweeping the fader this way, they're sweeping they're sweeping the frequency down. You can see that if I'm at 1,000 hertz at 60 phones, as they start sweeping the frequency to the left, I'm actually pulling that fader down in order to keep it at the same perceived loudness. But then when it gets to 300 or 400 hertz, I start moving that fader up because I'm not hearing those frequencies as well. I actually need to turn the sound up so it sounds the same loudness. Does that make sense? That's what these curves are showing. It's the position of the fader that a person would have to have the fader at to have the same perceived loudness at any given frequency. So you can see our low frequencies, we really don't hear very well because we've got to have those faders turned up pretty high to make them sound as loud as they were at 1,000 hertz. And the amount of we don't hear the lows very well changes with volume. So down real quiet at 20 decibels, we got to deck that fader down at the bottom of the frequency range so we can hear it at all. We don't hear low frequencies very well, especially when it's quiet. That's why when you turn your radio up, it not only sounds louder, it sounds better. Because you can see as we go from 20 phones to 40 to 60, 80, 100, our hearing response actually starts to flatten out. And we can hear those low frequencies better in comparison to the high frequencies, right? Now, see if we're at 1,000 hertz and we start going this way, we start going up in frequency as they're sweeping that frequency up, we're actually pulling that fader down to keep it at the same perceived loudness because we hear those frequencies between 3 and 5K. We hear them really well. So those frequencies have a very high perceived loudness. We have to turn the fader down to keep the perceived volume the same. And then they have to kind of go up again. So the super high frequencies, obviously, if you're over 30, you're not hearing anything above 15K anyway. So there are certain frequencies we hear really well, certain frequencies we don't hear very well, and that's what causes actual versus perceived loudness discrepancies. So there's a lot of jumbo here in order to say that there is a difference between actual and perceived loudness, and it has to do with your ear's ability to perceive frequencies. And that's why we say when you're trying to dial in your EQ, you want to do it at the same volume you're going to be playing at. If I'm dialing in my EQ at home and it's 60 dB at home, I've got one frequency response that my ears hear. I get on stage and it's 100 dB on stage. I hear frequencies very different on stage, and I may go, wow, that doesn't sound anything like it sounded at home. That's right, because your ears don't work the same way in loud volumes as they do in quiet volumes. And also your gear doesn't work the same way either. Your gear isn't perfect. It's you don't have a $50,000 amplifier. It's not completely linear. The way it amplifies sound is going to change as a function of volume. So when we're trying to balance out those sounds, we want to find a balance between actual and perceived loudness, because your audience doesn't have meters, they only have ears. So we're trying to nail the perceived loudness as best we can. Your engineer does have a meter though. So if we've got a sound that sounds roughly the same, but the actual loudness is the whole lot different, that meter and that compressor out front is going to react. Even if it doesn't sound different to the people, it does sound different to the machine. So we got to try to find the sweet spot between those two. All that to say, this is not a science. Well, there's some science involved, but there's an art to it as well. All right, let me get to these questions. Let's see. Do things keep needing to be adjusted? Then you add or piggyback. Yes. Yes. And that's why we said last night with Timothy, or last week with Timothy, that EQ is like voting. You want to do it early and often. So that's a Chicago joke. So we want to EQ early. And then after each effect that we add, you may have to re-EQ because that effect is going to affect the frequency balance. That's why it's called an effect. It's going to affect the frequency balance of what comes out of that. Now, a lot of your effects will have some EQ in them. You know, like you'll have a chorus or a reverb, and there will be a tone knob on that chorus or that reverb. That's EQ. So you don't necessarily have to put an EQ pedal in your pedal board after every effect. Sometimes those effects have EQ built into them. But like Timothy said, you may have 2 or 3 of those little 7-band equalizers. You may have more than one of them in your pedal board. And you may say, hey, when I kick this effect on, I also kick this EQ on because it needs to kind of be rebalanced. So the answer is yes. You will need to kind of change these things. And then Daniel, is there an overall ear fatigue frequency? Woohoo! Yeah, great question. So yes, your ears, as they fatigue in higher frequencies faster. And that's one of the reasons that we say when you're trying to dial your tone in, you want to do it at volume, you want to do it quickly so that you don't fatigue your ears. And the other piece is you want to have a reference recording that you're listening to because your ears get really easy to fool. Once they start hearing something, they will normalize that thing. Like you've probably been to a place where, wow, this mix sounded kind of muddy when I walked in. Yeah, by the end of the night, it's not bad. Wow, that engineer must have figured it out. Maybe he did, or maybe your ears just normalized it and they got used to hearing that dull sound and your brain just made an adjustment. Well, let me fix this, right? So it is possible to fatigue your ears. And if I've got a reference recording, say I've got a Ross Holmes recording, I use his name because I love the sound of his fiddle. I've got a Ross Holmes recording that I really like, just the overall EQ of his violin. As I'm trying to dial in the EQ of my violin, I may stick his recording on another track. And I'll play my violin, I'll kind of cut and monkey that thing around, and then I'm going to play the Ross Holmes recording. I'm going to go, oh, I was not anywhere close. And then I'll kind of monkey with mine a little more and then listen to his. All right, I'm getting closer now. And now I'm not going to match his tone all the way, but I may match his sort of EQ profile and say that, okay, we've got roughly the same amount of lows and mids and highs here, and it's going to sound, at least we're sort of in the same neighborhood as we were, right? So he's got a marble statue, I got a marble statue. It's not marble in Formica, right? So those are the kind of comparisons that you want to make, and that's why I like using a reference recording as I'm trying to dial in my tone. It's also why I was showing you guys in the example that I will kind of dial in a frequency and then I will turn off my EQ and go, what did it sound like before I made that change? And listen to it and then listen to the change and go, is it actually better? Probably 15 to 20 minutes is about as long as you really want to be really listening to those EQs. You want to do it relatively quickly, partly so that you don't get ear fatigue, partly so your ears don't normalize, and partly so you don't damage your hearing, because we are doing this at volume. Okay? So, yeah, great question. Yeah, I am too old, and I've been playing loud music for way too long. Is it better to put the EQ at the beginning of your chain or the end? Yes. You want your EQ in all of the places. I try to do the vast majority, like we're talking about sculpting, if we're going to use that analogy. I'm using my big sledgehammer at the beginning, and by the end I'm using like a little chisel. Okay? Does that make sense? Like I'm trying to get the big stuff done at the beginning. We're going to dump those low frequencies. We're going to do a massive high pass filter. We might do a pretty good scoop in the middle to kind of get rid of some of that mud. And then I'll do some of my effects. And then by the end, maybe I just need to trim out a little bit of 3K or just a little bit of 1K or whatever for the room. But yeah, I'm sort of starting big, and I want to get my source as good as I can. Instrument, preamp, EQ. And I want to get that right so that when I'm feeding signals to my effects pedals, I'm feeding a signal that they're going to be able to work with, and it doesn't have a bunch of nonsense in it. From Pete, what's happening, man? Did I mention soft rooms versus hard rooms? Yeah, so this is all totally different too. And some of this is EQ and some of this is reverb. So all this stuff kind of comes together, don't it? A live band playing in front of yeah. Very true. All of this is different. And in fact, the band that I toured with, Spare Change, we had RPA, we were in stereo. And it's not because we were doing a lot of panning. It's because we would sometimes play in asymmetrical rooms. Maybe you're in a room that's got a bunch of glass walls down one side, and then the other side is sort of open, right? And Wayne wanted to be able to EQ each one of those stacks differently. So yeah, room acoustics, I've got a glass wall that is going to act very differently than an open room. Oh, and when you put a bunch of meat sacks in there, sometimes we call them paying customers, you put those in there, they're going to change the room like a lot. So when I'm working as a front of house guy and I'm doing my sound check in an empty room, I'm trying to get gain structure right. I'm trying to get EQ in the neighborhood of where it needs to be. And I'm trying to get a rough and dirty mix. Really what I'm trying to do is make sure I don't have gain structure issues. And I want to make sure that everybody's in-ears are within about 80% of where they need to be. Then when we get a bunch of people in there, everything changes. So I'm not trying to get too crazy about getting a killer mix in an empty room because it's not necessarily super helpful. Sasha, thank you for coming. Awesome. Do I alternate EQ frequencies between 2 or 3 same instruments? Yes. Yes, absolutely. In fact, this is a thing that we do a lot with, and maybe we're getting away from strings a little bit, but that's fine. As a front of house guy, if I'm trying to make a kick drum and a bass lay right, both of those guys are down in the low frequencies. Usually the fundamental frequency of a kick drum is going to be in that 50 to 60 hertz range. That's where that real punch you in the chest kind of sound is coming to, that 50 or 60 hertz. Well, a bass guitar is also trying to occupy that space. So a lot of times what I will do, if I've got the kick, I've got like a nice 55 hertz slam on that kick. I will notch my bass guitar at 55 hertz so that kick frequency is going to jump through there. And then the bass is still going to be great because we still got some bass at 30 and 40 hertz. We still got bass at 60 and 70 hertz, but it's leaving some space for that kick drum to pop through. That's a thing you can do with EQ. The other thing you can do is with your compressor, and we'll get to this when we talk about side chain compression and all that. But then if we're using dynamic compression or dynamic EQ, that might be a thing that I would side chain, and I would tell my bass that when you're listening to the kick, that I want to notch out in that 40, 50, 60 hertz range for the kick, but only when the kick is coming. When there's no kick drum, I still want the full bass signal. But when the kick drum kicks for that, 0.2 of a second or whatever it is, notch the bass and get it out of the way. And there are ways to do all this. But yes, I would say if I've got 2 guitars and I've got one guy who tends to play kind of further down the neck and another guy who's tending to play up the neck, the guy who's playing further up the neck, I might run his high pass up a lot further so that his low frequencies, I'm getting them out of the way so that the guy or the woman who's playing heavy power chords, they can occupy that low frequency space, and I don't have people fighting for that same space. How do I create a vertical stereo sound? Yeah, we're getting a little deeper now. Some of that is going to be with, I actually use reverb for some of that, believe it or not, and I'll use some of that with my pre-delay on my reverb, and we can get into that a little more in the week that we're talking about reverb. But yes, in general, We want to make room for everybody to play. And that's why I said it's context. Your EQ is context dependent. If you are a solo performer, you're the only person on stage, I don't do much EQ at all except for the room. You know, if the room happens to be real bad at 300 hertz, we may scoop around 300 hertz to kind of clean the room up. But if it's just me, I'm sending all of it. I'm going to let my front of house guy or my front of house human, male, female, or otherwise, I'm going to let them deal with it, right? If I'm I try to do as much as I can. I really don't want to leave those things to a front of house person, especially if I don't know them. I try to do as much as I can. If I'm playing in a string section, which I never do, but if I was playing in it, I'm gonna for Christmas. But if I was gonna play in a string section, I would EQ my violin differently. If I'm playing first violin, I would thin it out quite a bit. If I'm playing second violin, I might pull some of my highs out to leave room for the violin, the first violin. And then I've got more of those sort of middle round frequencies. And then I just got to leave room at the bottom for Shauna to come in on the cello. I do have a couple more slides I want to get to, then we'll get to the rest of the questions. So we were talking about EQ, right? So the question is, oh, there we go. If overtones make instruments sound the way they do, you know, all these are different, right? I got a piano, a trumpet, a viola, a violin. If I can change EQ, and these EQs are making the instruments sound the way they sound, can I use EQ to make one instrument sound like another? Yes. Now, with a qualifier. So if we're just talking about the sustained tone of that instrument, we can do a lot. Now, when you hear a piano, it has a very specific envelope of the sound, right? You hear the hammer hitting the string, and that's a sound. And then you hear the string decaying, and that's a very specific sound. With a violin, you might hear the bow attack. With the guitar, you hear the pick attack. We're not talking about the envelope of the sound. I'm talking about the meat of the sound. There is a thing called tone matching that can get quite good. And you might need 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 band EQ, but computers can do these things. And in fact, it is what happens with these products here, the Tone Dexter, the Baggs Voice Print DI. There's some custom IRs, and these are things we're going to be talking about next week as we're talking about IRs. We're going to have Andrea Costa joining us from Italy, really fantastic violinist over there, and he does a ton of work with IRs. But what the Tone Dexter and the Baggs Voice Print DI and these custom IRs will do, they will take a sound, they will take, say, a Guarneri violin, and they will take your acoustic or your electric violin, and they will generate a EQ profile of the violin that you want to match and the violin that you have, and they just subtract those two profiles. And it might be, like I said, it might be 1,000 band EQ or 10,000 band EQ. And they can generate a mathematical equalizer difference between those two instruments. And then they can make, we call that the delta in science, we'd call that the delta, the difference between the two. And then they would just apply that delta to say, look at all these frequencies that the Guarneri has that your YEV doesn't have. Well, let's put them in there then. So they can do that, and you would be amazed at what they can do with these EQ tricks to make a YEV sound convincingly like it's got a wooden body on it that it doesn't actually have. So that's going to be next week. That's a preview for next week. Yeah, well, that's kind of the thing, is you do have to take up space. You are going to take up some space. You want to make sure that you're taking up the space that belongs to you and that they're taking up the space that belongs to them. And there is quite a bit of overlap, of course. We are an ensemble, and we do kind of share the same space, but we got to be good citizens about it, right? One of the things that I will tell violinists who complain, well, I got my tone really good, and then the front of house person just carved it all to hell. I had a really nice sound on my violin, and then I go out front and it's all tinny, like there's no mids in it at all. There's no presence. There's no meat to my sound at all. there's a couple of possibilities. One is that you've got an incompetent sound person and they don't know what they're doing, and they start turning knobs and, well, I don't know, just try to make this thing better. I always blame myself first and see if there's something I can do differently before I have to blame somebody else. And sometimes it is their fault, but sometimes it's my fault. And one of the things that I have experienced as an engineer when violinists are playing, especially people who have been first violinists in orchestras, they think the world revolves around them. And in a pop or a rock band or a country band or a worship band, whatever, it's not about you. It's about the singer. And so the singer is the new first violinist, and you, like it or not, you're the second violinist. You have to start thinking like a second violinist. So what will happen is these first violinists, they're just up here, I'm on stage, I ought to be playing, right? I paid for this instrument. People are here to see me. I should be playing. And they're not even listening to the singer. If the singer is doing something interesting, you should not be. Because what's going to happen is that the engineer is like, well, I have to make a choice. Because I got a violin trying to occupy space and a singer trying to occupy space. And guess which one's name is on the marquee out front? It ain't the violinist. So I'm either going to turn the violin down, or I'm going to scoop out the space that the singer is occupying, sort of those mid-range spaces, and I'm going to get you out of their way because you're in their way. So you have to ask yourself, if they've really scooped out all my mids there, why would they do that? If they're doing that because I'm playing when the singer is singing and I'm trying to occupy the same space that the singer is occupying, then that's not an incompetent engineer. That's a competent engineer who's doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They're doing what they've been paid to do. You made them do it. You made them do it. So listen to everybody who's not you. What I tell my students is listen with your ears to what's happening on stage and then play not that. So if you're hearing a bunch of stuff happening in mid, say the piano player's kind of living right around middle C. You shouldn't be living around middle C because you two are trying to occupy the same space. And guess which one of you is going to get scooped out? Not them. So that is one problem sometimes, and I hear it a lot. It's, you know who's worse about it than violinists? Harmonica players. Here's a move that a harmonica player has never done in their whole life. Pull that thing off your mouth. You can actually take rests, believe it or not. You don't have to play every note. And same thing for violinists. I will tell my students that this move right here, the one where you pick your bow off the string, that's the move that gets you paid. So if your playing is too busy, your calendar won't be. Whew, I know that sucks. We did a lot of practicing and everything, and I learned how to play in 53rd position, and I want my mom to know that those lessons paid off. Your mom don't want to hear that. Nobody else wants to hear it. Maybe your mom does. Nobody else wants to hear that. You make all your money in first position. Man, it's like bumper sticker central today. So make sure that you're not trying to occupy space with your playing, with the choices that you're making on stage. Make sure you're not trying to occupy the same space that other people are occupying, because if you are, the engineer has decisions to make, and your place on the hierarchy is not where it was in orchestra. Okay, sorry if that's a hard truth. Yes, Sasha, absolutely. Good tone solo is not necessarily good tone in a mix. And yep, guitarists who scoop mids you have to sort of understand, you have to understand the context that you're playing in, and you have to use your ears. These are not things that you have to do in orchestra. The composer does these things for you in orchestra. When you're playing in a band and you're writing your own parts, you're the composer. You have to make those decisions. You can't have, a composer's not going to have trombones and oboes trying to occupy the same space. They might be playing the same notes, but tonality, like they're getting them away from each other in ways that maybe we don't understand. We have to, as we're making sonic decisions on stage, we have to fill that role. We have to make sure that we're not trying to occupy the same space somebody else is occupying. So yes, you are part of a whole. Yeah, sometimes you're part of that whole. Sometimes you're part of this whole. Murat, what's happening, man? Speaking of orchestras, he's an orchestra guy. He knows what to do. So I hope all this was helpful for you guys. I hope this discussion and the examples that we did are helpful. If you joined us late, you can see the executive summary version of this video is on YouTube as of about 27 minutes ago. I filmed a shorter version of that this morning with the examples in it, and I always have that go live on YouTube about halfway through our discussion here. Next week, the plan, we know how plans are, but the plan is to have guest artist Andrea Costa is going to join us from Italy. I'm actually going to make a call with him on Monday, and then I'll be able to edit the video down and provide that to you guys on Wednesday. But we're going to be talking about impulse responses, and it sort of follows from what we were talking about EQ today. Yeah, really looking forward to that. So if you have any questions about EQ, feel free to dump those in the comments section, and I will do my best to answer them. Like I said, it was a comment on YouTube that generated this whole video today. So we had covered EQ last week. I thought we were moving on today, but I got a good question, and I could tell from the question that there were things I needed to cover that I didn't cover. So we just covered them. It's fine. It's no big deal. So I hope that was helpful. I hope you understand EQ better than you did. And now you're going to be able to use those tools to make your sound better. And as we get into the effects that are coming, remember all this stuff builds. This is like math class. All the stuff you learned today is important for what you're going to learn next week because you got to use it all, right? So anyway, hope all that was helpful. And I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend. If you're American and you're still eating leftover turkey, bless you. People around the world, you have no idea what I'm talking about. It's fine. You're not missing that much. There's a reason we don't eat turkey every day. But yeah, holiday gift giving season is coming. There are tons of holidays happening around the world. We just showed this earlier today. The HX1 is, we just got these in. It's a brand new product from line 6. All the cool effects that are in the Helix are in here. And these are but like half the price of the HX Stomp. And you can pick which effect you want, and you turn it on, turn it off. So if you've already got your pedal board built, your Rob Flax, and you got 50,000 giant pedal boards already built, and you're like, oh, I just need one more effect, because Lord knows we all just need one more. The HX1 might be exactly what you need, because it could be a chorus today, it could be a IR reader tomorrow, it could be a delay, it could be whatever. You can make it whatever you want, and it's easy to change it. But once you've got it in the board, and it's sitting there, you got one effect to turn on and off, and yeah, super nice. It's a great product. So see you guys next week, and yeah, have a good one.